It seems that the timeline of human history has already been thoroughly studied, and the past holds no more surprises for us. However, one only needs to step away from standard interpretations and carefully examine surviving technical artifacts for the coherent picture to begin crumbling. This is particularly evident when closely analyzing cast iron heating devices from the 19th century. These units, which are classified today as ordinary wood or coal stoves, upon closer inspection, demonstrate a number of design features that completely contradict their official purpose. First of all, the quality of craftsmanship is striking. These are true masterpieces of artistic casting, with a level of detail that testifies to a remarkably high culture of production. If a need arose today to replicate such items, manufacturing processes would have to be radically changed, as modern methods often fall short of the backward technologies of the past. But if we cast aside aesthetics and approach these units from a strictly engineering point of view, an insurmountable cognitive dissonance arises. The design of these stoves comes into direct conflict with the physics of burning solid fuel. The key problem lies in the dimensions and layout of the combustion chambers. The fuel doors in many models are made so miniature that it is physically impossible to fit a standard-sized log through them. This forces us to assume that if they were fired at all, it was with wood chips or fine coal. But here the question of efficiency arises. To heat a spacious room, let alone the halls of ancient mansions with high ceilings, one would need to burn huge volumes of wood. With such a small firebox volume, the stoker would be forced to stand by the stove around the clock, adding fuel literally every few minutes, which seems absolutely irrational. An even more serious mystery is the absence or strange placement of life support systems for the fire. The combustion process requires an oxygen supply and smoke removal. However, many antique samples completely lack ash pans and blowers. Where in that case did the ash go? Did the fuel burn without residue? The smoke extraction system is also baffling. On some stoves, pipe connections are located in the most unexpected places, at the bottom or on the side, while on others they're missing entirely, replaced only by decorative grills. Using a wood stove without a powerful exhaust pipe in a living space would inevitably lead to smoke inhalation and carbon monoxide poisoning. Furthermore, complex mechanical regulators are often found on the bodies of these devices. Handles and rotating mechanisms are located on the doors, at the base, or on the top lid. For a simple damper or blower, such complexity is excessive. It creates the impression that these knobs controlled not the airflow, but some other, more subtle process requiring precise tuning. Some examples even resemble mobile, portable devices that could be placed in a tent or carriage. Their size is so small that using solid fuel in them becomes meaningless. The heat from a handful of coals wouldn't last even half an hour. All these facts suggest that these devices were originally created to operate on a completely different physical principle. They were not intended for burning wood. The pipes and makeshift modifications that can be seen on museum exhibits today are most likely the result of later adaptations. People who inherited high-tech devices but lost the original consumables were forced to improvise, drilling holes and adapting complex units for primitive organic burning. The original design, however, implied the use of compact, powerful, and clean energy sources that were simply inserted inside and provided heat without smoke or soot. Confirmation of this guess can be found not in history textbooks, but right on the bodies of the items themselves. where factory markings capable of shocking the modern observer are cast. The key to solving the functional purpose of these strange units lies literally on the surface, cast in metal on the doors and side panels. On many surviving examples, the word radium is clearly legible, and sometimes the internationally familiar symbol warning of radiation is found. Characteristic triangular signs or stylized rays diverging from the center. The presence of such markings on household heating appliances of the 19th and early 20th centuries seems unthinkable to a modern person. Yet it is this detail that puts everything in its place and explains the design oddities described earlier. If we assume that these stoves were originally designed not as chambers for burning wood, but as containers for housing high-tech fuel elements based on radium or other radiating substances, then the engineering absurdity instantly turns into a coherent and logical system. In this context, the microscopic dimensions of the combustion chambers become justified. Housing a compact active capsule does not require much space. The absence of ash pans and blowers also finds an explanation, since the process of heat release during radioactive decay or another radiation reaction does not require an oxygen supply and does not leave mountains of ash behind. Heat is generated by the material itself, heating the massive cast iron body, which in turn radiates soft and powerful heat into the room. This hypothesis brilliantly solves one of the main mysteries of ancient architecture: the problem of heating huge palaces, castles, and cathedrals. Anyone who has visited such structures in winter knows how difficult it is to heat stone halls with ceilings several meters high. Traditional open-fire fireplaces are catastrophically inefficient in such conditions. Their efficiency tends towards zero. The lion's share of the heat flies up the chimney along with the smoke, and the strong draft creates constant drafts, pulling already heated air outside. A person standing by such a fireplace faces an unpleasant effect. Their face is scorched by heat, while their back freezes. Heating a suite of rooms in this way during winter is practically impossible without destroying forests on an industrial scale, and the round-the-clock work of an entire army of stokers. However, if we assume the use of autonomous radium heaters, the picture changes radically. One such cast iron unit, charged with an active element, is capable of working for months, and possibly years, maintaining a stable temperature without the need for constant maintenance. The pipes sometimes found on such designs could have been intended not for smoke, but for venting specific gases released during the element's decay, or served as part of a convection system for circulating hot air. Most likely, this is exactly how comfort was ensured in the huge residences of the past, which today stand as cold monuments. There is documentary evidence indirectly confirming this theory. For example, French postcards from the 1910s directly depict scenes of daily life with captions like, "heating with radium." Official history interprets this as the naive fantasies of artists inspired by the recent discovery of the Curies. But is it possible that these were not dreams of the future, but sketches from life, or advertisements for a technology that actually existed? Supporting the forgotten technology version is how these stoves were subsequently used. When the supply of factory fuel elements ran out, and the technologies for their production were lost or classified, the owners of unique devices had no choice but to adapt them for available fuel. Wood and coal came into play, for which they had to cut holes in a makeshift manner, weld on chimneys, and put up with low efficiency, turning a high-tech device into an ordinary potbelly stove. The radiation sign on the stove door is not a decoration, and not a warning of danger in the modern sense, but a marking of the fuel type, similar to the diesel inscription on an engine. And if such compact sources of colossal energy were widely used in everyday life to heat homes, it would be extremely illogical to assume that industry and transport ignored such an opportunity. After all, it is in the transport sector that the need for powerful and autonomous energy sources has always been particularly acute. A look at the history of railway development from this angle allows one to notice glaring inconsistencies in the official version of technical progress. What we are told about locomotives and infrastructure of the 19th century, upon careful examination, bursts at the seams as soon as one asks the question, what did these steel giants actually run on? If the assumption about compact high-energy elements is correct for domestic use, it would be the height of wastefulness not to use this technology in industry and transport. It is here, in the sphere of railway communication, that the most massive and glaring inconsistencies of the official historical version are revealed. Looking at the pace of development of transport networks at the end of the 19th century, it is impossible to shake the feeling that we are missing a key element of the puzzle that explains the incredible efficiency of that era. The most striking example is the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway. According to archival data, the continuous rail track from Mias in the southern Urals to Vladivostok and Port Arthur was laid in just 13.5 years, from March 1891 to September 1904. We are talking about a distance of almost 10,000 kilometers, laid through taiga, swamps, permafrost, and rock. The average construction rate was about 740 kilometers per year, and this, we are assured, was done using primitive manual labor, shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows, without modern road-building machinery. Such speed seems fantastic even for today, let alone for times more than 100 years ago. Such results are possible only in two cases. Either the builders possessed technologies superior to our current ones, or they were not building the road from scratch, but merely excavating and restoring already existing tracks of an ancient global network. However, even more questions are raised by the technical device itself for which these tracks were laid: the steam locomotive. When closely studying the design of a classic locomotive of that time, one is struck by its engineering complexity. It is not just a stove on wheels, but a complex thermodynamic unit, entangled in thousands of tubes, valves, pressure gauges, and regulators. The internal structure of a steam locomotive surprisingly resembles the operating scheme of a power plant on a modern nuclear submarine. The principle of operation is similar. A heat source heats water, turning it into high-pressure steam, which performs mechanical work. The only difference is that on a submarine, the water is heated by a reactor with fissionable uranium, while in a steam locomotive, as is commonly believed, it is heated by burning wood or coal. And here arises the main logical contradiction: the discrepancy between the highest level of complexity of the machine itself and the primitive nature of the fuel storage system for it. If a locomotive is the pinnacle of engineering thought, requiring qualified specialists with deep knowledge of physics and mechanics to operate, then why does the infrastructure for refueling it look so archaic? Look at how coal is stored at railway stations. Huge piles under the open sky, exposed to rain and snow. Getting wet, coal not only loses its calorific value, but also begins to rot, heat up, and often spontaneously combust. It is impossible to extinguish such smoldering waste heaps with water. They are simply pulled apart by bulldozers, waiting for them to burn out. The situation with wood is even more lamentable. Under the influence of precipitation, it rots and becomes damp, becoming practically unsuitable for effective steam generation. Did the designers who created such a perfect machine as the steam locomotive failed to come up with a basic canopy for fuel? Or is it that initially, these locomotives were not intended to burn coal and wood at all? This guess is confirmed by the attitude toward another component of traction: water. Unlike coal depots, water towers of that era represent true works of architectural art. They were built of high-quality brick, decorated with complex decor elements, investing huge funds in aesthetics and durability. These temples of water stand to this day, striking with their monumentality. This reverent attitude toward water and complete disregard for coal suggests that water was the main working fluid, and coal was only a later, forced, and extremely inefficient replacement for the true heat source. It is highly likely that initially, that very hypothetical element was placed in the locomotive's firebox, a conditional cartridge with radium or another active substance. It provided stable and powerful heating of water without smoke, soot, or the need to drag a tender with tons of dirty fuel behind. This explains the complexity of the design, the cleanliness of train stations in old photographs, and the lack of developed coal infrastructure in the early period of railway operation. When the resource of high-tech elements was exhausted, and the technology for their production was lost, humanity had to transfer complex machines to forage, burning forests and subsoil resources in them, resigning themselves to a monstrous drop in efficiency. The technologies existed, the infrastructure functioned flawlessly, ensuring cheap and high-speed travel. But at some point, a breakdown occurred, and the perpetual motion machine had to be fired with wood. To understand where this mysterious energy source disappeared, and why the very word radium today is associated exclusively with danger, it is necessary to examine the history of its official discovery. And here, when diving into the biographies of famous discoverers, the official version begins to look less like a chronicle of science and more like a poorly directed detective story with elements of mystification. The school curriculum and popular literature paint a painfully romantic but completely implausible image of the discovery of radium. We are told a touching story about the spouses Pierre and Marie Curie, who, being poor enthusiasts, worked in a leaky shed with a dirt floor. According to this legend, they processed ore with their bare hands in simple basins and cauldrons, driven only by pure scientific interest, and in the end, at the cost of their own health, gave the world a new element. However, one only has to compare this beautiful myth with the dry figures of production reports and financial documentation of that time to see that the official version does not withstand any criticism and looks more like a cover operation for something much larger. Let's turn to the physics and logistics of the process. To obtain just 1 gram of pure radium, it is necessary to process colossal volumes of raw materials. The technological chain requires hundreds of cisterns of water, 5 train cars of various chemical reagents, 100 cars of coal to maintain temperature regimes, and, most importantly, dozens of tons of uranium pitchblende. To imagine that 2 people, even if geniuses, could organize and conduct such a process in the artisanal conditions of a shed is physically impossible. This is the level of serious industrial production requiring huge financial injections and complex logistics. Here are the true curators of this project, whose names usually remain in the shadows, enter the stage. It is known that the uranium ore for the Curie experiments was provided by the Austrian government with the assistance of the President of the Academy of Sciences. But this was only part of the necessary resources. The main sponsor, who paid for the remaining 10 tons of ore and related expenses, was Baron Edmund de Rothschild. The participation of a figure of such scale, a representative of one of the richest and most influential clans on the planet, completely changes the picture. Bankers of the Rothschild level never invest funds in abstract scientific fantasies without a guarantee of a result. Most likely, the Baron knew perfectly well what exactly needed to be found. One gets the impression that the task of the Curie spouses was not to discover something new, but to restore the lost technology of producing that very fuel of the past on which both eternal stoves and locomotives ran. The elites were trying to regain control over the energy source of the previous civilization. Even more questions are raised by the biological aspect of this story, which completely contradicts modern concepts of radiation sickness. We are told that the discoverers paid with their lives for their experiments, but the facts suggest otherwise. Pierre Curie did not die from radiation at all. His life ended tragically and quite suspiciously under the wheels of a horse-drawn carriage just a few years after receiving the Nobel Prize. Was this a way to eliminate a witness or participant who learned too much about the real properties of the substance being extracted? Marie Curie, who worked for decades with radium, polonium, and uranium without any protection, literally carried test tubes with isotopes in her pockets and kept them at her bedside instead of a nightlight. By today's standards, she should have burned out in a matter of months. However, she lived to be 66 years old, a very respectable age for that time. Moreover, 2 years after her husband's death, continuing active work with radioactive substances, she began a passionate romance with a young officer, which testifies to excellent physical health and high vitality, and not at all to the fading of the body. Radiation, it seems, not only did not kill her, but possibly stimulated her life forces. The most compelling proof that we do not know something about the nature of that historical radium is Marie's children. Her second daughter, Eve, was born during the period when her mother was already working closely with concentrates of radiating substances. According to modern medical canons, the child should have received serious genetic damage. But Eve Curie was not only born healthy, she lived an incredibly long and full life, passing away at the age of 102. She was a beautiful, talented, and energetic woman who outlived almost all her contemporaries. Her older sister, Irene, also followed in her mother's footsteps, worked with radiation, and lived a decent life. A paradoxical situation arises. On the one hand, 1 gram of radium cost fabulous money, more than 200 kilograms of gold, and its extraction was financed by the richest people in the world. On the other hand, people who were at the epicenter of radiation demonstrated enviable longevity and health. This suggests that the substance they were extracting was not a deadly poison, but a powerful source of energy and, possibly, biological stimulation. But if this is so, why was a global information campaign subsequently launched, turning the word radiation into a synonym for inevitable death? And how to explain the fact that with a cost exceeding the price of gold hundreds of times, products with added radium suddenly flooded pharmacies and stores all over the world, becoming available to every layperson? Here lies another grand mystification. Analyzing the history of humanity's interaction with radium, we encounter an economic paradox that, upon closer inspection, looks like a frank mockery of common sense. This contradiction is so glaring that it alone is capable of destroying the official version of events. Let us recall the dry facts. The extraction of radium was a process of incredible complexity and high cost. The market value of 1 gram of this substance at the beginning of the 20th century was equivalent to the cost of more than 200 kilograms of pure gold. It was the most expensive material on the planet, available only to selected financial clans and government structures. And at the very same time, as if by the wave of a magic wand, the shelves of shops and pharmacies were flooded with mass consumption goods with the proud prefix radium. Advertising brochures of that time are full of offers: toothpaste with radium for a white smile, radioactive powder for glowing skin, chocolate with radium for vitality, and even water enriched with radium emanations as a cure for all diseases. There were special household dispensers, revigators, which allegedly saturated drinking water with healing energy at home. Here arises an elementary arithmetic problem that has no solution within the framework of official history. How could a substance, a gram of which costs a fortune, end up in a tube of toothpaste costing a few coins? If manufacturers really added pure radium there, the price of such paste would exceed the budget of a small town. If they put microscopic, homeopathic doses there, then there could be no physical effect, which the advertising shouted about. There are only 2 logical exits from this dead end. The first option. It was a grandiose marketing scam, comparable to modern nanotechnologies in cosmetics. Enterprising dealers, taking advantage of the hype around the new discovery, sold dummies to the gullible public. Instead of precious radium, cheap phosphors, or, at best, pennyworth thorium salts and other less active elements were added to the composition to create the appearance of science. People paid for a beautiful name without receiving either the promised benefit or real harm, except for emptying their wallets. The second option is much more sinister and implies the existence of a long-term strategy to discredit the energy source. Perhaps the elites, realizing the potential of radium technologies, those same eternal stoves and engines, decided to hide them from the broad masses. But it was impossible to simply ban what all the newspapers were writing about. Therefore, an operation was launched to desacralize and subsequently demonize the substance. First, radium was turned into a laughingstock and a household toy, reducing a great technology to the level of a corn remedy and face cream. And then, when the market became satiated with these dubious goods, the pendulum was swung in the opposite direction. An information campaign began, based on real or fabricated tragedies. The story of the Radium Girls, who painted watch dials and received serious illnesses, was replicated with maximum coverage. Suddenly, the life-giving ray was declared an invisible killer. This allowed for the introduction of strict state regulation, the confiscation of all free stocks of radioactive substances, and the monopolization of this sphere under the pretext of public safety. The psychological effect was achieved brilliantly. The average person developed a conditioned reflex. The word radiation became synonymous with agonizing decay and an inevitable fatal outcome. Fear paralyzed any desire of independent researchers to work in this direction. Who in their right mind would build a generator in their garage based on what is generally believed to kill everything living? Thus, humanity voluntarily gave up the search for autonomous energy sources, returning to burning hydrocarbons and becoming dependent on centralized fuel supplies. But is the nature of this phenomenon as unambiguous as we were taught in the mid-20th century? Does any ionizing radiation really bring only the destruction of biological tissue? Observations of nature and certain historical paradoxes force us to doubt this dogma. There are facts that science prefers to ignore, as they completely cross out the created picture of the world where radiation is absolute evil. Perhaps we have simply forgotten how to distinguish between two fundamentally different types of the same phenomenon. The modern paradigm of radiation perception is based on an unequivocal statement. It is invisible death, destroying the very structure of DNA, causing mutations and incurable ailments. The Geiger counter, emitting an alarming crackle, has become a harbinger of the apocalypse for us. However, if we cast aside fears driven into the subconscious and turn to objective reality, to observations of living nature and facts that science prefers to shamefully silence, a completely different picture opens up. We are faced with a fundamental misunderstanding, or intentional distortion, of the very physics of this process. Everything points to the fact that there are two fundamentally different types of radiation, which our primitive instruments record identically, but whose impact on biological organisms is diametrically opposite. The first type is indeed combat. Destructive radiation, the result of violent splitting of the nucleus, a dirty byproduct of weapon technologies and catastrophes. But there is also a second type, natural or technologically ordered radiation, which, judging by everything, is not an enemy, but a powerful catalyst for life processes and an ideal source of heat. The best testing ground for verifying this theory has become the Chernobyl exclusion zone. According to expert forecasts made immediately after the accident, this territory was supposed to turn into a scorched, radioactive desert where life would be impossible for centuries. Scientists painted terrible pictures of mutants and dead forests. The reality 3 decades later has plunged the scientific world into shock, which they try not to advertise. The exclusion zone has turned into one of the richest and most thriving nature reserves on the continent. Where dosimeters go off the scale, a real biological explosion is observed. Populations of wolves, elk, deer, and boars have not just recovered, they exceed the indicators in clean forests many times over. Rare species have returned there, such as the black stork or Przewalski's horse. The animals look healthy, active, and produce numerous and strong offspring without any signs of genetic deformities. Vegetation takes over cities with incredible speed. Trees grow faster and more powerfully. It creates the impression that the increased radiation background acts on the biosphere as an elixir of life, accelerating metabolism and enhancing regeneration as soon as the main destructive factor, humans, was removed from the equation. A similar phenomenon, destroying official dogma, is observed in Japan. People who survived the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, known as hibakusha, according to the logic of the linear no-threshold model, should have faded away in agony. However, statistics show the opposite. Among this group, an anomalously high percentage of long livers is observed, many of whom have crossed the centenary mark. Their children and grandchildren were born healthy, contrary to all the frightening predictions of geneticists. This forces us to assume that short-term exposure to a powerful flow of energy, if it does not kill instantly by thermal shock, can trigger hidden reserves of recovery in the body. All this leads us to the thought that the technologies of the past, those very stoves and fireplaces marked radium, used precisely this white spectrum of radiation. Engineers of that era knew how to extract pure thermal energy from the substance, which was safe for humans. It was a soft, warming heat, similar to sunlight, which is also, in essence, radiation. Those very radioactive waters and cosmetics of the turn of the century may have actually worked and healed while the technology was correct. The advertising didn't lie. It simply described effects that we have lost today. We, having found the remnants of this knowledge, failed to distinguish creative energy from destructive energy, mixed everything into one pile under the danger sign, and banned it. The idea that humanity used cheap and safe decay energy for centuries and was then forcibly switched to the needle of hydrocarbons explains many historical oddities. Moreover, this technology was likely not an invention of the 19th century. Cast iron stoves and steam locomotives are just the sunset, the last echoes of a great civilization that possessed these secrets to perfection. If we look deeper into history, we will see that the traces of atmospheric or radiant heating lead us to antiquity. There, among the ruins of ancient Rome, exactly the same engineering inconsistencies are discovered that we saw in the mansions of the Victorian era. The official version of how the Romans heated their famous villas and baths, when tested by practice, crumbles to dust, exposing an even more ancient layer of lost technologies. The connection between times turns out to be much stronger than is commonly believed, and the threads of lost technologies stretch from the Victorian era into deep antiquity. If we look closely at the engineering solutions of ancient Rome, we will find a mirror reflection of the same oddities as in the cast iron stoves of the 19th century. Official historical science offers us the term hypocaust, an underfloor heating system that supposedly heated luxurious villas and public baths. We are told that under the floor there were vast voids with columns where hot air circulated from fires that slaves burned around the clock in special furnaces outside the building. However, anyone familiar with stovework or the operation of solid fuel boilers will point out fatal flaws in this theory. Burning wood is inevitably accompanied by the release of a huge amount of soot, grime, and tar. These combustion products settle on the walls of chimneys, requiring regular and laborious cleaning. If this is not done, the passage section narrows, the draft disappears, and, most terrifyingly, the accumulated soot can ignite, creating a temperature capable of destroying stone. Imagining the process of cleaning a labyrinth of low underground channels, less than a meter high, is practically impossible. How could a slave crawl into these narrow, soot-filled catacombs to clean out layers of soot accumulated over many years? This is a technically impossible task. But the most damning argument against the wood-burning version is provided by the ruins themselves. During excavations of Roman baths and villas, archaeologists find those very underground spaces. And what do we see? The brick and stone inside these chimneys are pristine. There isn't a centimeter of carbon deposits, no traces of thermal destruction, no ingrained soot that should have inevitably soaked into the porous clay over centuries of operation. These surfaces look as if they were laid yesterday. They have not seen open fire. This is physical proof that the heat carrier was fundamentally different. The Romans, like the engineers of the 19th century, used clean energy. The pillars under the floor served not as smoke splitters, but probably as heat accumulation elements or nests for placing those very active elements we spoke of earlier. The energy source was placed in the underground space, heated the stone mass, and the warm floor gave off soft, uniform heat into the room. Without smoke, without carbon monoxide, without the need to cut down forests around the city and keep an army of stokers. It was a technology providing autonomous comfort for decades with a single load. Thus, a complete picture of global technological degradation emerges before us. We live on the ruins of a civilization that possessed the secret of obtaining cheap, if not free, energy. Whether it be Roman villas or tenement houses of St. Petersburg in the 19th century, the principle was the same. Buildings were designed for autonomous heat sources that did not require connection to mains. Huge windows, high ceilings, the absence of vestibules in old buildings, all this was calculated for a powerful and constant flow of heat that did not need to be saved. However, then a certain global failure, catastrophe, or division of the world occurred, as a result of which the key element of the technology, the fuel itself, was confiscated, banned, or lost. Magnificent engineering systems turned into useless decor. The heirs of the great era had to adapt to the harsh reality, punching through walls for chimneys, installing ugly pipes, filling unique underground systems with earth, and switching to primitive burning of organics. The saddest part of this story is the economic aspect. The transition from autonomous, eternal sources to combustible fuel marked the beginning of the era of energy slavery. It is impossible to put a meter on the process of atomic decay or the operation of an ether capacitor. But it is very easy to sell people coal, wood, gas, and electricity, forcing them to pay for every kilowatt of heat. Perhaps that is why radium technologies were so carefully discredited and then erased from memory, replaced by fairy tales about bonfires under the floor and primitive stoves. In conclusion, one thing is worth saying. The world around us is full of silent witnesses to a different past. They stand on the streets of our cities, in museums, at train stations, and in old estates. Official history tries to throw a veil of habitual explanations over them, but this fabric bursts at the seams at the slightest touch of logic. It is enough just to stop taking textbook texts on faith and start looking at things with your own eyes, asking inconvenient engineering questions. Details that we are used to not noticing, the cleanliness of the brick, the absence of a chimney, the strange sign on the door, are capable of destroying the false picture of the world and opening the door to understanding who we really were and what was taken from us. The truth is not hidden behind 7 seals. It lies right in front of us, waiting for the one who dares to see it.